And I'm so glad that she's going to be remaining on the steering committee for the year to come. So I'll be able to continue to work with her. Today we are celebrating the certificate students that have completed their certificates. So we have 2 students today that we're going to be recognizing. So I'd just like you to, you can say hello if you're here. So our first recipient is Hae-Hyun Han. I think I saw Hae-Hyun. Yes, wonderful. Thank you for being here. If you would like to say hello.
Hello, I'm Hae-Hyun Han from South Korea, and I so happy to be a part of this program at GTU in my PhD program, and it was very impressive moment to be a part of women's religion course last semester, and I finally finished my program.
Wonderful, congratulations. And our second student that has completed the certificate this year is Rachel San Diego.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel San Diego. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I cannot say enough about the Women's Studies and Religion community, as well as the program. It has really helped me to align my focuses, my studies, even projects, and working alongside other women throughout the GTU. And I'm so thankful for that. And now that I'm graduating, I am going on to internship next year at Seattle Lutheran Emmanuel Lutheran Church under a Pastor Priscilla, who is a woman of color. And it's a position that I had to advocate for, that I had to fundraise money for. And so I'm thankful for the women in this community that I just learned from and heard from, that also gave me the encouragement and empowerment to do that work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So if we can just do a little clap emoji to congratulate all of our 2 students for this year. Thank you for the hard work and for being part of our program. I'd also like to take a moment to thank those that are going to be leaving our steering committee. So we have Brianna Deutsch, who has been part of our steering committee, a student steering committee member for 3 years. So we'd like to thank you for your service. And then we have Mariska Lauterboom Tiwa, who's also been a student representative on our steering committee for the last 3 years. So we'd like to thank them. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Jennifer Davidson. Unfortunately, she's unable to be here today, but we would just like to recognize the fact that she was a chair for this program in 2012 to 2013, as well as from 2016 to 2019. So she has been a chair over the years for 4 years total, and been a part of the steering committee as a faculty member for more years than that. And she's going to be stepping off this year. So we'd just like to thank her for all of the service that she's given to WSR, and we look forward to continuing to work with her. Okay, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Valerie Miles-Tribble to thank our wonderful coordinator.
Yes, indeed. We just want to give thanks. A part of the efficiency, the wonderful offerings, the beauty of a program is when you have a coordinator, and our program really survives not only on our faculty volunteer leadership, but when you have a coordinator as wonderful as Cheryl Johnson has been through her PhD studies, and now that she has finished and is Dr. Cheryl Johnson, she is moving on to other horizons. And so our coordinator position will be open, and she has graciously agreed to work alongside of whoever might be interested. But basically it's to help us all stay organized, to be in touch with students, to make sure that course hours are recorded and to help us with the wonderful events and offerings that we do. So we have a job description on our website. You can always email, again, the email that Cheryl has put in the chat, wsr@ses.gtu.edu, if you have any interest. And Cheryl, we just love you and appreciate you and continue to hold you up in our prayers for your success in all of your pursuits. You rock. And I think you can see all across the cameras, those that know you, there's thumbs up, there's hearts, there's applause, all of those wonderful things. So thank you. All right. Is there anything else that we've missed? No? All right. Then I will go ahead and get started. And it is indeed my pleasure to be with you as we consider the topic that was promoted on today. And I ask us to just focus on the urgency for intersectional justice, amplifying women's studies in religion as a faith-driven pathway. Now that's a long title, that's a mouthful, and I will try to unpack it in my comments, but I really invite you along, because even though some of the slides will specifically mention GTU, the Women's Studies in Religion program is a national and a global effort undertaken by many schools, and so and not undertaken by some schools. And so I hope that my comments will inspire all of us, and for those who are on with us from those national and international places, to just reflect upon what's happening in your neighborhood. Okay. All right. So I want to greet you and thank you for joining. I'm Valerie Miles-Tribble. I'm Associate Professor of Ministerial Leadership and Practical Theology at the Berkeley School of Theology, formerly ABSW, and I'm also core doctoral faculty at the Graduate Theological Union here in Berkeley. Now, as a little bit of a narrative and self-introduction, I was born and raised in Philadelphia. I'm the daughter of Rosie Scott Miles and James Miles, the maternal granddaughter of Alice Burrell Scott and John Scott, the paternal granddaughter of Bertha Lee Miles. I graduated from an HBCU at Hampton University in Virginia. I am a California transplant who remained after completing my graduate studies in public health at UC Berkeley. And so my careers in perinatal, high-risk infants and mothers, and then in the private sector of the business world informed my lens before the divine intervention with a ministry calling that shifted my priorities. Still, pastoral service in male-dominated circles resurfaced questions that I had about justice and equity, with a passion formed from coming of age in the civil rights era, particularly after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. My theological trajectory always included commitments to the uplift of women, mentoring girls into womanhood, and seeking the welfare of our underserved communities. I still am passionate about ethical and equitable leadership. So I continue to hone my skills in leadership development and try to encourage others to find their voice as I persisted to use my own, even in a society that didn't find it worthy to be heard. Now, as a womanist scholar teaching in these Black Lives Matter times, I situate my teaching amid the societal dissonance to encourage students of all backgrounds to understand their own narrative as life informing their scholarship and their ministry as public roles. Our narratives inform who we are. And it is important that we dig deep, however unpleasant or whatever unpleasantness might be in those narratives. It is what has formed you and helped to make you who you are. So even as I've authored articles and a recent book on the urgency for pedagogical and ecclesial preparation as interreligious collaborators and change agents, I'm jolted daily as I find still blatant threats to our freedom, as many more than we realize are bent on returning us to a society in which certain voices are still not deemed worthy to be heard. So it's in this volatile backdrop that I invite you to join me today to grapple with the intersectional identities and disparity issues that impact our urban and rural communities where our students minister, whether or not they're in pastoral positions. And I share with you today, through the frame of our GTU program, Women's Studies in Religion, I share as the outgoing chair of the program's steering committee, although as Dr. Ashley Bakke said, I'll continue to serve, and I look forward to her visionary leadership as a very capable leader, but I also look forward to the leadership of fellow faculty and students who either serve on the steering committee or benefit from the opportunity to earn a GTU-WSR certificate. So I'm going to share my screen so that I won't be a talking head in the matter, and have us consider what is involved, what is at stake, and what is possible. Now, across theological education, emphasis on women's studies in religion can become a path to attract diverse voices, to raise new lenses of scholarship and ministry and justice praxis. And so I'll share some PowerPoint slides as I talk to raise some observations about the credible contributions that, in my opinion, women's studies in religion could offer if amplified to encourage non-binary, diverse, interreligious engagement of women and men. Now, as the event was promoted, I want to focus a positive light on women's studies as a pathway or a focus area of specialization that many graduate schools might have under the rubric of gender studies. They might combine it with other types of focus areas. However, I focus specifically today on women's studies of religion rather than just women's studies, because of the potential for its expanded lens to include interdisciplinary approaches to theology and interreligious investigation. Yet my question posed today, as you see in purple, is to ask if we are underutilizing this opportunity to increase voice, increase reach, increase intersectional scholarship at institutions across the country, and especially even here at the GTU. So I invite us to examine intersectional disparities and non-traditional approaches aimed at furthering our justice quest for deeper appreciation of our narratives and mutual respect of our distinctions in order to achieve the harmony of restorative peace for all. Now, is this aim utopian? Yes. Is it impossible? I hope not. I also want to suggest that faculty and students can be more intentional to forge pathways that take seriously the justice issues continually raised by many intergenerational and interfaith voices beyond the binary assumptions that inhibit our identities and otherwise limit the authenticity of diversity and equity. And so I want to make 4 declarations to get us started. 1, women's studies in religion is not solely for women. Male students and non-binary lenses are welcome, yet the lenses should center gender concerns for equity. How powerful would it be if more of our male students and male faculty embrace these lenses in their scholarship? Second, WSR is not just about women, yet the lenses do include intersectional analysis of multi-characteristic injustices impacting our communities and usually impacting women of color and poor women. Therefore, children and families are also at the lowest rung of the social ladder. Number 3, WSR does not require you to self-identify as a feminist or a womanist as a philosophical, theological, ethical, or ideological lens. Yet, WSR should be open to the diversity of interreligious and interdisciplinary research questions and exploration. And then number 4, WSR should be about a commitment to social change, a heart for justice, because it does require recognition of integral roles women have as translators of values, survival of our families, and often the backbone of our communities. Now, the purpose for us today is to consider the urgency for WSR programs to be centered and enhanced. And I want to make just a couple of observations about contributions that women's studies in religion across the country offers. First, where to amplify and encourage women's studies and faculty to examine intersectional disparities and non-traditional approaches. Where better than through this type of program? We also need to observe and consider how can faculty and students be intentional to forge pathways that take seriously the justice issues raised by those intergenerational and interfaith voices. And we also need to consider why. Why must we move beyond binary presumptions that inhibit identities and otherwise limit the authenticity of diversity and equity? So those are the things we need to consider. Now, as a brief overview, we'll touch on the history or herstory of women's studies in religion with origins in the 70s. We'll consider some present factors of inclusion or exclusion. And then I'll wrap up with a future look and some recommendations. So first, the history. Women's studies of religion, as did the Women's Studies program, evolved out of the feminist movement and the major strands of the feminist movement. Women's liberation in the 60s and 70s initially rejected Western male patriarchy and androcentrism and misogynistic elitism. The effort and the aim was for economic parity and access to opportunities that men had. The first Women's Studies of Religion meetings at AAR occurred in 1972, primarily through a white second wave of feminist gender parity lenses who were seeking also global diversity, religious diversity, the ability to start new movements. And Harvard Divinity School hosted the first program. WSR also expanded a gender analysis of past and present praxis with scriptural and organizational critique of our faith institutions, where religion was practiced primarily by male-dominated leaders. There also was added an interreligious voice in being a place, women's studies of religion being a place where Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist lenses help to reformulate traditions beyond the Judeo-Christian images of the divine. The focus of women's studies in its initial iteration was also on spirituality, beyond institutional, doctrinal spirituality as dictated in those male spaces. And so the women's study of religion lens considered mind, body, and spirit, with goddess scholarship and Sophia movements being part of the early efforts, particularly as I recall being emphasized at the GTU when I began seminary eons ago. Now, the problems with this is that there was some presumptive misappropriation of indigenous traditions, presuming to speak for others, even well-meaning to include women's voices, resulted in, and unbeknownst, it is mentioned in some of my resource materials, unbeknownst to a lot of feminism, they were not realizing that they were building up a global negativity, if you will, eschewing feminism and its privilege lens as a label. And so the good things about women's studies of religion and its links to the early feminist movement is that it built in epistemological, methodological frames, and with more women writing and providing text to counter this generic science of man or male-centered experience as a priori. It also helped as an early critique in the academy that had ignored the intersectional experiences. However, another issue was that it too, the early feminist lens, also ignored intersectional experiences of racism, classism, structural poverty, sexuality. Certain lenses were ignored or downplayed. Thus, there has been over the years a non-white, non-Western women's move to eschew feminism's liberalist claims, calling it a privileged parity fight. Now, let's move to the present. The present concerns with contextuality demands, and it begins in the 20th century as well, in the civil rights movement, as global justice movements asserted distinct identities and disparities and claimed that we needed to understand these intersectional distinctions, that one group didn't speak for all groups, that there were experiences of sexism, yes, but there were also experiences of poverty and racism with added issues of identity that warrant our voices and our study. And so as more voices, as awareness is increased, more intersectional issues come to the fore as more clamor to be at the table with their narratives and to develop methods for investigating and legitimating the realness of their lived experiences. Likewise, interreligious customs raised ideological diversity among women to resist the hetero-Christian white gaze. And then we have had in this 20th century, the coming out and the assertion, rightly so, of queer voices and identities to raise double oppression of sex and gender as issues that need our attention. Presently, also in this landscape, there are interdisciplinary demands. When we talk about gender justice, we are acknowledging that feminism doesn't equal womanism, may not even equal Black feminism. They all have gender issues, but they have areas of focus where they want their voices to be heard. Gender justice also should include male and female advocacy to critique these isms. One of the things that we find in our Women's Studies of Religion program, we've been delighted when our male scholars have had the agency to not only take classes and our seminars and attend, but to be part of our steering committee. We welcome this. As soon as one hears Women's Studies of Religion, if you say, no, that's not for me, you are perpetuating the disparities. We also have in this interdisciplinary demand, gender justice as a way, needs to be a way to challenge civic and institutional praxis that disproportionately underserves the needs, the diverse needs in our communities. And so the interdisciplinary lens that we can bring to this in all of our different identities comes from the areas of study that we have, even here at the GTU and across theological institutions: historical lenses, lenses of global religion, society, sociology, anthropology, ethics, liturgy, textual hermeneutics, art, music, literary psychology. None of these are excluded from adding their voices to Women's Studies of Religion sensibilities. Now, what about the future? There are some urgent issues that we need to consider. First, we need to consider across the country, and for someone with a microphone on, I can hear pages rustling. First, we need to consider, where are the missing voices and identities still in our well-meaning efforts to be inclusive? We need to look at intergenerational and public arenas and consider that there are still justice analyses that our scholars, faculty, and students can still do around the religio-politics of power, place, policy, and constituencies. Our intergenerational and public spheres are raising resistance. They're raising resistance to religion and to the institutions that have conflated themselves with this rise of sectarian nationalism as a backlash to Black Lives Matter. So there's suspicion about religion. There's suspicion about our faith voices. And that calls us to do even more to make sure that those suspicions are heard and are incorporated into our dialogue. There's also Indigenous and non-Christian voices and identities that are still missing, and they are clamoring to be at the table. Gender is not a singular point of accord, and we have to destruct the ideologies of privilege, race, xenophobia, the ecological abuses, the doctrinal shifts, and really push for relationships that can align and collaborate. Because on today's public arena, the doctrinal shifts are trying to move away from consistently aligned relationships into silos. We also need to look for those missing voices and identities in the environmental and eco-justice spheres, because there are sustainability issues of inequality and access and sustainable resources that we need to center Mother Earth. And even if we as Christian and as Judeo-Christians look at our biblical texts, we find that earth and mother and wisdom are feminized. And so there is an importance because of the life that springs forth and the nurturing. So there is an importance for us to recenter our sustainability issues. And I'm glad that we have a center and a focus under the vision of Drs. Cynthia Molobita and Drs. Rita Sharma to do that in different ways. We also are missing the identities of, and I'm saying missing in terms of future urgencies, not GTU missing, but we need to be mindful of the global post-colonial rejection of what we have presumed to be centered as religious dogma and practices and methods. There is a push and a return to ancestral retrieval of syncretic rituals, indigenous religious ecology. Post-colonial Christianity rejects and recrafts the primacy of their global identities and relations for what those traditions mean to them, even amid the missiology and the surge of Christianity in those nations. There is a critique when our religion has been imperialized by empire to take over indigenous peoples. So we need to consider then, what are the roles for diverse interreligious traditions? How can we be more intentional about this theology of being? We do it in, and these are my opinions, we do it in recapturing the transcendent movement in our human relationships. By whatever understanding the transcendent being of the divine is in your lens and your tradition, we need to raise that up and celebrate it in our practices and our beliefs. We also need to be mindful of the enactment in our human to human relationships. How do we practice communal prayers, worship, justice, public witness? Is there just one way? How do we celebrate the multiplicity of that? As our steering committee tried to do, I believe at the end of the year, when we tried to have a multicultural, interreligious lifting of voices to just celebrate surviving 2020. Now, I'm making some observations, and here's where I may get in trouble. I told Cheryl and Ashley, because I want to raise, do we take women's studies in religion seriously? How can faculty and courses and GTU research topics incorporate women's studies of religion-related issues? And where are the gaps? There are some gaps. There are gaps across the country, not just at the GTU. And so we can generate attention and generate distinguished student leadership capabilities and preparation opportunities. How about study grants and aligning with our centers to increase funding and promotion of students who want to do scholarship in these areas? We can do better awareness raising events, or even special publication issues. Like I just guest authored an issue of Review and Expositor around leading change as sacred praxis and centering female voices for their perspectives. We can identify new voices and issues and learning need priorities as we find out where our students are passionate about, or where their experiences have been that they have been told for so long were not important. And now we're trying to help them lift up and center those experiences in their studies. And we can promote opportunities for WSR research areas in GTU recruitment. What about strategic core leadership competencies around these areas of women's studies and religion and all the interdisciplinary foci? So I had the audacity, I took a minute to sort of develop a schematic as I thought about future changes and mapping courses with curriculum and with skills process analysis. What if we were intentional, fellow faculty, to develop our courses not only around gender issues, but around issues of awareness, desire, knowledge, action, and perseverance, so that those who are in our classes that want to bring a women's studies lens can incorporate these processes and these analysis into their diverse gender studies. Awareness, of course, is self-awareness and the urgency of what we're up against in this world that wants to remove diversity and have compliance with one school of thought. Desire is just to stimulate motivation and to keep this hope, this crazy hope, fueled and imagining that our future impact has some importance. We also can use our knowledge to assess the environmental factors. What capacity do we have? What methods, what impact analysis of new research that our students are coming through with? And of course, action is the hardest. Even when we are out in the public square doing public witness, action is hardest amid the fear of failure. But success also is just the courage to try and retry again when we don't make it the first time. And that leads to perseverance, resilience, and to make sure that our school has some long-term strategies so that WSR and its programs can be with us for a long time to come. Now, what are the implications of this for social change? Of course, it includes the institution, students, and faculty. And so from an institutional, from a student lens, let me start with the students first. There's the interreligious context of the GTU consortium and a way that students and we can assess WSR research, hopefully providing more diagnostic skills to identify the needs and understanding how this attentiveness will help to increase our equity, inclusion, and diversity efficacy in our attempts here at the GTU. We can engage with the Center for Ethics, Values, and Culture. We can engage with the Sustainability Institute. We can engage with the Eco-Justice Institute under the scholars and faculty that I just named, to be intentional about encouraging students to coordinate some of these efforts. Institutionally, without a measure of evaluation on how effective these programs and these collaborations, how intentional are we moving into these areas of collaboration? Without evaluation, presumptions of leadership readiness could be under or overrated. And so having WSR and being more intentional about collaborative efforts offer opportunities to enhance the leadership potential of our students as well as our faculty. And then for faculty, we of course are trying to expose students to self-reflect on what their justice capabilities are, to not presume that they're not able because of maybe the background that they came from where this was not welcomed and now they want to do something. We are helping them to self-reflect on those capabilities and how to prepare themselves for leadership in very non-traditional roles. Now, recruitment opportunities. There are opportunities that institutions, schools, including the GTU, can use when they showcase programs like WSR. Using them as an example around the justice issues to recruit students. Are you interested in issues of identity, voice, and context? You can apply to the GTU and to any of our affiliate seminaries. And so does this opportunity appear in our applications? Does this opportunity get urged and stressed in our orientation? Do we have prompts about equity, inclusion, and diversity and the welcoming of intersectional interests? What can we do to recruit and invite guest faculty in residence for a period of time that might have expertise in some of these intensive immersions that we could offer, and go after donors and financing for those periods of time around focus on certain issues, and engaging our library technology to support categorized web access around WSR topics, around sustainability topics, have some way that if someone is doing that kind of intersectional research, there's also another search engine to take them right there to a wide cadre of resources. And then how do we amp up our official institutional sponsorships to stimulate participation? I just know there's donors out there that want to give money to these kind of cutting edge research resources. How can we add more fellowships beyond our new hall so that this kind of cutting edge work can be done? I believe that we can do it. And so I just want to summarize and saying, ultimately, our students as leader practitioners and our fellow faculty colleagues, we are the ones that are preparing others to positively impact secular and faith-based ministry roles. But if we don't market ourselves, if we don't toot our horns, if we don't recruit, the media and the public square has it sounding like there's only one kind of narrow, siloed theology. So how does our WSR work benefit our justice climate and outcomes at the GTU and beyond? And these are questions that we can ask in any one of our institutions. So I would like to close with recommending some future directions for study, refining analysis, gathering recruitment data, and build to center. And that's a play on a phrase that I'll come back to in a minute. First of all, study. Consider and compare our class offerings, perhaps faculty getting together either in our CDF or other areas to be more intentional about what offerings and certificates can be tied to those offerings over time cycles. Refined our analysis to conduct even factor analysis based on itemized scales of students in our program, students who've taken our courses, what kinds of jobs did they go out and get, and look at those variables and continue to evaluate them so that we begin to have some data to justify the usage of our institutes and centers like WSR, so that hopefully WSR's program can one day build to center, to reapproach the study linkages and demographics and need and design assessment as students move to workplace roles and tap into the public through our GTUX or through Theo Talks and doing things that help WSR program move into the future to once again become a center that now is not just a narrow feminist lens, but a diverse, interreligious, intercultural lens that can be a place where we can do some groundbreaking research and work. And in addition with the analysis, we also can be looking at recruitment data. And I think WSR can play a role in helping to personalize contact modes and consider the tangible incentives to motivate student and faculty participation around research that incorporates this lens and this sensibility. It doesn't mean, once again, that you must be a woman or a female to do intersectional WSR work. So we need some more advanced means of promotion. And so with that, I'm going to open it up for questions and discussion. Presented a lot of ideas, and I'm curious to hear what's in the chat.
So we've not gotten any questions in the chat, so I do invite our guests today to put any questions that you might have for Dr. Valerie into the chat for them to be read. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. Really so much to think about.
It's been my pleasure, my pleasure. I really believe in the importance of our women's studies in religion program and gender studies across the country. But if we are not careful, my friends, as more and more censorship is occurring around critical race theory, before we know it, there will be censorship around gender studies. Before we know it, there will be censorship around intersectional issues. We cannot afford to let this happen. This is why I am clamoring about the urgency of our attentiveness to making sure that our program remains a stellar cutting edge program here on the West Coast and Harvard on the East Coast. Other questions? We've tried to allot 30 minutes to hear from you. So we
do have a question from Michelle. Dr. V, you talked about the theology of being. Can you talk about a theology of meaning making?
Yes, yes, yes. I think a theology of being is part of that meaning making. First of all, a theology of being is understanding ourselves as divinely created, understanding ourselves as being worthy to use our voice, to live our lives, to pursue our dreams. And so part of that theology of meaning making is to really understand the centrality of our stories, our narratives, because in sharing those stories and those narratives, we are creating an awareness to find more places that we share in common than differences that keep us apart. As we share those narratives, each time I go to my meditative place and remember that I am the daughter of, the granddaughter of, the great-granddaughter of, and have traced my great-great-grandfather to slavery, it gives new meaning to what I am here for. And so the theology of meaning making helps us to be intentional about understanding that in the true grounding of the African concept of Ubuntu, that I am because we are, and that I cannot be unless we can be, that nature and everything around us is part of our survival, which is why I am just so pleased that we have an eco-justice focus and a sustainability focus, because we cannot presume that Mother Earth is going to exist without us. We cannot presume that we will exist without each other.
So a question from Dr. Rita Sharma. Many WSR programs are being subsumed under gender studies, but the unique problems of women and religion cannot be conflated with gender studies, although there is overlap. How do we foreground women's studies in religion without undermining intersectional issues?
I think that it is, and thank you for raising that question, Dr. Rita, because I noted early in my comments that many schools have gone to a heading or a classification of gender studies, and you get lost in that. Again, women's studies of religion says that we have possibly a wide breadth or a diverse levels of interest in different topics, and we come at them from our global perspectives and our interreligious perspectives. And those questions may not necessarily focus just on gender as in parity with male opportunities for jobs, but might focus, as I mentioned earlier, on how we understand the earth as mother. That is looking at a different approach to our ecology through a lens and by perhaps women and men who see the importance of capturing how life is brought forth from the earth. So I hope that we will be intentional here at the GTU in answer to your question, beloved Dr. Sharma, and I will be an ally intentional for keeping our identity as women's studies in religion, because we are raising all of those interdisciplinary, interreligious, intercultural, non-Christian voices as well, and experiences, and inviting our students to pursue them contextually and to help them conscientize themselves, raise awareness about what is needed in their respective fields and contexts.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Lauren, Dr. Valerie, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. What can we, your audience today, do with the recommendations you've made in your lecture?
Well, since I'm always a little subversive in my faculty pastoral activist role, I would urge you to take some of the things that we have discussed and go back to your institutions, because I see that some of you are across the country. Go back to your theological institutions, go back to your classrooms, go back to your faculty advisor and ask questions about ways in which you can incorporate some of these things so that these voices don't get lost in the clamor. And the most non-threatening way, and we have recorded this, and I can make these slides available. Most of the students know in my classes, I don't have a lock on PowerPoints. I make the PowerPoints available. So if you can use them and go make a presentation on it, awesome. I will share the PowerPoints because it is important that we begin to think about how our identities are being lost. There's a real intentional move to not allow us places for our voices to be heard, to limit what we can research. And I'm telling you, it's not just, what is the word? An exercise of rhetoric. It's not just rhetoric. It is really being planned. When I speak to congressional and senatorial colleagues and friends, this is underway, my friends, and we can't let it happen.
Thank you. Question from Dr. Majibin Dalla. How can we iterate the religion in WSR studies, especially when faith-inspired feminist approaches are not considered authentic feminism by the mainstream?
Well, I think there's been in recent events that I've attended, and some of you have attended also, there's been interesting dialogue about this feminist and Black feminist distinctions. There's been interesting dialogue about Black feminists and womanist distinctions. And I think all of that is well and good to help you yourself situate where you want your scholarship and your methodology to go. However, I think that it is important that we not necessarily spend our time Majibin trying to overcome what say the more traditional or secular feminist lens has been, but to really, again, use that voice to position ourselves and say what is the premise, the basis, and the direction that you meaning you rhetorically, everyone, you are taking your study, so that we're not being we're not, I believe in being proactive and not reactive. I'm not trying to justify myself to someone else. I'm trying to encourage my voice and others to be lifted up just because you have a transcendent right to do so. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. I love that, proactive versus reactive. Wonderful. Ayana asks, verbalizing where we come from, our foremothers' names and their stories cannot be overstated. Reaching deep and excavating our personal lineages and desires for justice are paramount to sustaining a collective of women identifying scholars and ministers who are committed to each other and to work ahead. However, there seems to be larger gaps in women's experience and understanding. How can we close the gap at the GTU?
And this is true. Thank you, Ayana. The reason that I made such an emphasis early on about women's studies and religion, not just being for women, that men are invited to the table. There are men who identify themselves as feminists. There are men who identify themselves as womanists or pro-women's issues. What they're trying to say is that I'm not part of the pack over there that wants to shut you down. I'm part of the pack that's advocating and wanting to do what I can to further the needs, concerns, and the realities of disparities that are out there on whatever the intersectional level is. And so I think that that one of our biggest challenges, Ayana is right, is when we leave the academy where we talk to each other, where we can deliberate with each other. When we leave the academy and go into the community, go back to our churches, our mosques, our temples, even the women want to know, what's this feminist stuff? What's this womanist stuff? Why do I need to know it? Why is it important? They're more apt to be the ones to marginalize a female leader or a female voice coming in than perhaps some of the men are but we have to understand that's because of the embedded conditioning the way that we have been raised. All of us may have examples that we could share where we've grown out of something that we were taught as we became more exposed and enlightened. So I think that my mantra has always been, and those who've been in my classes know, first we have to contextualize and get people to talk about what they have experienced as injustices and breakthroughs. And then we have to conscientize by helping them to understand that there are far more out there who might not have gotten those opportunities. Help them to say what their passion is, what legacy do they want to leave. If it connects to something very personal to them, they are more apt to rally around and get out of their comfort zone and try something new. They are more apt to critically self-reflect about the ways in which they have marginalized and been against female voices and leaders because of this embedded association in our Christian spheres, embedded association of the male pastor with Jesus Christ. How many other voices, texts, articles, journals, speakers can we help them by exposing them to, by having discussion without judgment? That's how we come to understand who we are and where we've come from. And again, let me be clear. I'm not talking about rejecting our upbringing. I'm not talking about rejecting our religious traditions, but it's how do we function and flourish within them so that we're not shut down, but so that we can contribute.
Thank you. Question from Lori. Dr. Valerie, how do we make this more visible in the secular world?
Well, some of those events that we can be very strategically creative. Again, we have to realize, and I see my sister, Dr. Marcia Brown Woodard on here from Lancaster Seminary. We realize, and we've talked about, she and I have talked about, we're in an increasingly secular world. And we did touch on the suspicions around religion and faith. So I think the way that we do that, Lori, is first of all, trying to meet people where they are with all of the contextual, social, environmental, intersectional issues that we're all trying to survive in, and have that be a starting place, and be listeners rather than proselytizers, in listening for where and watching how the Spirit enters that circle of conversation. We may not have to say a single word about the service is 11 o'clock on Sunday. If you've said some of the right things, you will get asked, and where are you? And what time, you know, but when you go out with this well-meaning book and knocking people over the head judgmentally, then you are fostering the stereotype. So I think that we need to be more mindful in our justice work, in our intersectional studies, in all of these things that we've discussed. We need to be more mindful on how to be, and I don't like to use a war term, but it's what's coming to mind, soldiers, but co-conspirators, how to be justice co-conspirators rather than the holier than thou notion of the saint and the sinner. Because guess what? We all are.
Wonderful. Any other questions? Please put them in the chat. I have a question, Dr. Valerie. I'd like to hear just some kind of practical tips that you use in the classroom to kind of push your students, you know, as you mentioned in your PowerPoint. I'd like to hear your strategies of how you employ that in the classroom.
I learned this from one of my mentors, womanist scholar, Reverend Dr. Linda Thomas from the Lutheran School of Theology, affiliated with the Chicago complex. She came out to teach an intensive and to be a speaker. And this is actually, this is an example of one of the creative methods that I was maybe referencing in my comments. There was an opportunity for a community-based group to do more womanist conferences and workshops to specifically engage women in the pews, women in our neighborhoods. We were trying to get them to understand what that identity of being a Black woman, an African-American woman, a woman of faith might mean, and how we are studying it in our various institutions. So as we were doing that particular year, I remember 2015, we needed a place. It had grown to such an extent since we had started doing it that no church was big enough. So we tried to host it at the GTU, at one of the seminaries. And so in doing so, we had this gathering that we had planned for Saturday, but perhaps we could combine it, if we were bringing speakers out, with a Friday night or a Friday evening event, and then to help get donors and to make it worth these speaker in residence time, we tagged it on to an intercession course that she could stay and teach. So she was actually here with us for a little over a week. And so learning from her, being in her presence, she already was a mentor, but this was my first time of being in her presence as a teacher. And one of the first things she did in that gathering was a breathing awareness covenantal exercise in which she took the time for people to tell their stories, that all important narrative. She took the time to covenant that we would hold those stories and narratives sacred. And then she took the time to request that whatever we talked about in class would remain in the class, particularly if it, so that we could build a trust area of people needing to share stories or needing to work through trauma or hurt. Certainly share the content material, but our interaction, our interrelatedness needed to remain. I have tried to emulate that in my classes, in making the early part of the class, beyond going through the syllabus, be a covenantal time, and try to make those intentional spaces of check-in and creativity. I think it goes a long way to building community and to hopefully recognizing and reinforcing the recognition of each one of the students as valued.
Thank you. Any questions? Again, just put in the chat.
I think I was so mindful, as I'm apt to go too long, that I that I rushed through my my PowerPoint slides, but really the dialogue and the ideas from you are what I wanted. I didn't want to just be a talking head. This was intended to be, let's throw some ideas on the table. Let's hear what you're doing across the country. Let's hear what you're doing in schools. One of the things that we need, and I will do a little plug right now, women's studies in religion program, as we still are, needs more active faculty to take what we're trying to do seriously enough to be part of our steering committee. We meet once a month to develop programmatic ideas. Coordinator like Cheryl or her successor help us to check with other parts of the GTU to get that going. But it is fellow faculty, male and female, our presence of support and commitment to make sure that we help to promote and to include classes, make our students aware of classes that other colleagues are teaching where they can find their voice. That's the commitment that we're giving. So I invite you to join me this coming year.
And we are also looking for student steering committee members as well. So if we have students here, again, that's one meeting a month, and it's a great leadership opportunity, and it's wonderful service that you're doing in good community. Okay, so so for questions about the talk, we can email directly Dr. Valerie, or also email wsr@ses.gtu.edu. And we have a few kind of follow-ups. There was a suggestion for reaching out to WSR alums. And this is not a question, but your suggestion about scholars in residence, deeper partnership with other departments, perfect. GTU is primed to engage deep diversity and interreligious engagement. Yes.
I think we all have a role to play. Think about in your communities. We talked about the early waves of feminism, and we talked about the first generation of womanists, and we've talked about women in our circles who have been role models to us that are neither, as I said, neither feminist nor womanist. They don't even want to go with those labels. They're just someone who has survived their life, okay? And they've come to an age perhaps where they want to give back. You may not realize how many men and women you have in your midst that are potential donors to give to, so that a special event can occur, so that a special program can occur. And imagine if we have some interest and people have said, yes, just let me know what it costs. I can give a few $1,000s. I can give a few $100s. Now, of course, we have to go through our GTU process. Don't panic, GTU administrators. We have to go through those approval processes to think about how we can accept that money and get it in. But the point is, we surely won't get if we don't ask. And I think that there are many out there whose stories we would value, even asking them to come in or to do a Zoom narrative of their lives, and to consider being one of our supporter donors or things, just getting creative in ways that we can bring the community into our sphere and our reach of women's studies and religion, of eco-justice, and of sustainability areas.
Thank you. And it's important to highlight too that donating is not only about monetary, it's also about time and skill sets. So I liked how you brought up sharing stories in the way that we want more. This is a unique time in that due to this pandemic, we are all on Zoom. And so we're able to have conversations with people and offer events that typically would have just been restricted to in-person events, right? And so we're still going to be in that space in the fall. And so if there are events that are happening at your schools or that you know of at other places, please do let us know. We'd like to advertise them. We want our students and our faculty to know about these opportunities. We want to be part of a wider network. And we want other networks to know about our events as well. And so if you do have, we can discuss, those cross advertising opportunities, and those are in some ways are like donations. It's ways of building community. So a question from Dr. Rita Sharma. Dr. Miles-Tribble, motherhood has been increasingly problematized as part of an oppressive gender binary. This Mother's Day, there were many calls for no mention of Mother's Day in churches, so as to not hurt those who are not mothers, or do not have mothers, or cannot become mothers. How can we honor the lives and experiences of others, men and LGBTQIA, without undermining the visceral, complex, challenging, often dangerous, sometimes painful, and wholly embodied experience of cisgender femaleness?
Excellent question, thank you. And this is exactly one of the dialogue points that I love to invite and have. Yes, motherhood is problematized because our society has genderized it. However, motherhood is also a natural part of our existence. We don't get here without someone having been our biological mother. May not have been a good one, might not have been a just one, but birth is something that we can't ignore or eliminate. Instead, we talk about the ways in which mothering or motherhood or mentoring doesn't have to be gendered, that there are men being mothers, that there are non-binary friends that I know that are parenting, that are raising phenomenal young people, that have adopted, that are doing those kinds of things, such that we allow society to lay these things over on us. It's like the media. They take something, they twist it and skew it, and then we all start following that. It is something that we need to honor the realities of the pain, the losses, the folks who didn't get it right, but at the same time, there might have been a neighbor down the street, like my latchkey neighbor, who was a guardian and sort of grand to all of us when our parents had to work 2 and 3 jobs so that we would still get our homework done. There are still ways that we can think of this in terms of community. So yes, if Mother's Day is only being shown on TV as this ultra pure being in pearls, who has the perfect kitchen and the perfect meal and the perfect clothes, we need to eschew that. Okay, not negate it, because for some people it may be that might have been their mother, but we need to understand that there are expanded views of nurturing caring, community raising, and how we can all be part of those places for those who might still need that kind of nurturing, whether we call it mentoring, whether we call it role modeling, whether we call it communaling. It is still something that I think we can break down the cisgendered labels that get put on it and still be, as I believe it's that we say often, a mother to the motherless and a father to the fatherless. We also need to understand the ways in which our non-binary colleagues, compatriots, loved ones may have been rejected by their families. And still, I don't hear many of them saying they don't need family. The community, our circle of friends, our colleagues, we become the family. So when we begin to counter some of these notions with other conceptual, proactive identities and invite the intersections to come in, then we are inviting ourselves to overcome those cisgendered labels.
Thank you.
Now I see a question to Dr. Shermer from someone else that, am I reading into your question that motherhood equals cisgender femaleness? I hope I've answered that. And I think that she, that Dr. Shermer was asking about the very things I was just saying. Yeah.
And I think that ties into this need for storytelling and also vulnerability that kind of comes out in the examples that you've mentioned throughout this talk, Dr. Valerie. How I think that there is, especially around loss, when there's we've been trained, just as we're talking about kind of breaking out of those cycles, we've been trained to kind of be quiet about losses, and so that can, I think that's part of what you're when I was hearing you speak, I think that that gets highlighted for me, how we need to make space for our stories to be told so we become comfortable with them as well, right? And so then that helps break these kind of dogmatic categorizations that everyone's been raised around, acknowledging, having the space to acknowledge loss.
So true, so true. Part of our identities might not be related to gender, but might be related to different kinds of addictions, might be related to having been part of the carceral system. If there is shame in having that be part of your narrative, particularly if that then results in the blessing of you being able to share how you came through it and could be an inspiration for a whole bunch of people in the room, then something is wrong. And so we've got to quit trying to be what someone else dictates us to be. But first of all, to appreciate who we were born, how we were born, and even if we have taken steps to be who we were born through our trans realities, that's our narrative. And I think that part of having a program like the Women's Studies in Religion, having other programs and institutes as we've tried to do here at the GTU, helps people to find that space and place where they feel there's a fit and they can tell their stories. Now, that's not to say, though, that the GTU is nirvana. There are still people that think that all this talk of intersectionality and liberation theologies and womanist feminist identities and cisgender and trans and all of these things is not legitimate scholarship, is not authoritarian theology. They exist. but it doesn't mean that because they feel that way, that I have to be quiet in my authenticity of who I am, how I teach, and how I encourage others to be in their authenticity. And I think the more that we do it, the more that there's a groundswell of public witness and justice work like this, the more our younger generations will find that there's more out there on this faith journey. Perhaps that they even want to reclaim if they just know where they can go and be safe. So we have work to do. There's urgent work to do. And I think that it can, that the GTU can be one place, as with our other theological institutions. Let me just share and I don't have the statistic because I probably can't find the chart. Right now, I'm in a Association of Theological Schools class or workshop for intensive class for mid-year faculty. If you can only imagine my jaw drop when I saw how the majority of schools, mainline Protestant theology schools, I don't know if you can see me, are this little thin line to this amount of now evangelical member schools that are part of ATS. Now, I'm not saying, and I'm not dissing, don't go back and said Dr. Val dissed all evangelicals. That's not what I'm doing. I am saying that if the conservative agenda of pushing through a very narrow theology, like some of the ultra conservatives who have put up a whole paper and analysis and statement about social justice should not be the work of the church. If those kinds of agendas are part of the majority, rising majority of schools among the ATS schools, then you have a lot of students that are going to be clamoring for where can we go? Where's safe? Where can I recognize that I too am worthy of identity and voice and research? And I'm not saying that all of those schools will preclude you from doing it there, but I do know faculty and students that have a more difficult time in certain places than others. So no matter where we are located as students or faculty, we have a responsibility to make sure that in our humanity of voices and experiences, that diverse ones can be heard.
Wonderful, really strong points there. And to emphasize what you brought up earlier, that the GTU and Harvard Divinity are the only two theological schools that have a WSR, a Women's Studies in Religion program.
When I Googled, that's all that came up, and I kept Googling and looking.
Yeah, so even though with that kind of small amount of, in comparison to now this kind of conservative evangelical push, even within those schools, we're talking about there's not kind of systematic programs that this is being pushed for. And so it's something that we need to work for institutionally, right, that it needs to be prioritized.
And Jess, I know it's 5:30 and we need to end, but one other intersection I will leave you with is economic. So if we have this small of mainline Protestant theological institutions and seminaries, and the profile of our schools are students who face financial and fiscal challenges of getting a theological education or getting an advanced degree. What I am learning is that among the larger percentage of ATS schools, financial aid may not be as much of an issue because there may be denominations and churches and other things, other groups that support them. So we have to raise the question of ourselves, are we going to become an elitist place of theological training, where only those who can afford it, who can buy their way in, get the theological education and therefore get to use their voice and publish and be heard as this quote unquote authoritarian? That raises a whole nother set of legal issues for me. So that's something else we need to think about. But it is 5:30, and I am aware that we promised to let you go at 5:30. So I just thank you, all of you, each and every one of you, for being part of this chat, this deliberation about the urgency for us to consider how we keep diversity and how we utilize a gem like women's studies of religion more seriously in our institutional life. Thank you all, and have a blessed day and evening.
And we thank you, teacher. Thank you for such a wonderful talk.